Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing simchat le'olam, kol ha'yeladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we bring joy to the world by talking about the prophets and their writings. And some weeks, we talk about unusual Haftarah portions.
Oh no, we're not back to another Ezekiel was surely the strangest prophet routine.
No, Rick, you know that we're not reading from Ezekiel this week, but we'll get back to him next week for Kedoshim, twice in fact. But this week, we're reading from the second book of Kings and a couple of miraculous stories that focus on another of our favorite prophets, Elisha. But first, I'm Larry Herman, drinking some very fine wine, cognac today, and talking Haftarah with my very good chaver, the king of cantillation, Rick Muller. How are you doing, Rick? How was your Passover?
That's funny, because we're actually recording this episode during Chol HaMoed Pesach. But it's been good. How's yours been?
Rick, don't give away our secrets. But mine's been good too. We're now in the period of the Omer counting, which is a whirlwind of holidays and commemorative days, which start with Yom HaShoah, then Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, Lag BaOmer, Yom Yerushalayim, and Shavuot.
Sounds yummy and even delicious. But you left out Cinco de Mayo and Mother's Day. Anyway, what did you mean by unusual Haftarah portions?
Ah, yes. Back to this week's Haftarah for Parshat Tazria.
Excuse me, this week we actually read the double portion of Tazria Matzorah.
Right. But as I was trying to explain, the Haftarah that we normally read for Tazria is not...
Sorry to interrupt again, but this Shabbat is also Rosh Chodesh, so we read the Haftarah for Rosh Chodesh.
Right. But if you let me explain, I wanted to point out just how it is.
And you know, as I was reviewing for today's episode, I noticed that last year, Shabbat HaChodesh coincided with Tazria. So we read a special Haftarah then too. So when, if ever, do we read the regular Haftarah for Tazria?
Rick, that's just what I've been trying to tell our viewers and you. We only read the regular Haftarah for Tazria about 20% of the time. The rest of the time, we read the Haftarah for Mitzorah, for Rosh Chodesh, or for Shabbat HaChodesh.
Didn't I just say all that?
Indeed you did, Rick. Anyway, the next time we read the plain vanilla Haftarah for Tazria is next year, which is a lot sooner than the next time we read the regular Haftarah for Vayakel, which, as we explained last month, we've got a long time to go. And we've got another of those rare Haftarah gems coming up this summer.
That would be Pinchas.
You know,
it'd be interesting to see a chart that showed how often each Haftarah is read.
And also how often each prophet is read. I'm working on it, Rick. But let's get back to Elisha.
Yeah, and how about if you explain why you call Elisha one of our favorite prophets?
Doesn't everyone like a magician? The stories of Elisha are some of the most popular in the Bible. Elisha is a miracle worker, and the Haftarah for Tazria recounts 2 of Elisha's miracles. By some counts, Elisha performed 36 miracles, double those performed by his mentor, Elijah.
Okay, but he didn't make it into the Passover Seder like Elijah, did he?
No, he didn't, Rick. Nor did he make it into the Brit Milah ceremony like Elijah. Elijah is the more important prophet in Jewish theology, since he is supposed to announce the coming of the Messiah. But Elisha's stories are pretty entertaining, as we will see in the Haftarah.
Entertaining, yes. But one does wonder why they deserve to be read year after year.
Not year after year, Rick, only about 1 in 5 years. But your question is a good one. The simple answer is that the Parsha of Tazria mainly concerns itself with the matter of tzara'at, which is often translated as leprosy. And the main story and miracle described in our Haftarah is Elisha's curing a mitzora, or a leper, the powerful commander of the Aramean army, Naaman. So there's the connection.
I get it. That's the hook, and it's an intriguing story. But there's got to be more than that, don't you think?
Rick, I do. But first, let me briefly describe the Naaman story.
Go for it.
I hope that our viewers will read this very interesting story in detail on their own. Naaman is the general of the armies of the kingdom of Aram, which lies northeast of Israel and Judea. Naaman has some sort of skin blemish that he wants treated.
You got cosmetic surgery?
Kind of. He's told of the powers of Elisha by his wife's Israelite slave girl. Naaman asks his king's permission to visit the prophet. His king tells him to go to the king of Israel and gives him gifts and a letter. When Naaman brings the letter to the king of Israel, the king misunderstands, thinking that Naaman is asking him, the king, to cure his tzara'at, and suspects some deceit. But Elisha hears about the encounter and instructs the king to send Naaman to him. Elisha then sends a messenger to instruct Naaman to bathe in the Jordan River as a cure, which Naaman thinks is ridiculous. He's about to return to Aram when his servants convince him to try to give it a try. He does. He's cured, and then he exclaims that he knows the one true God.
Hallelujah.
Naaman offers Elisha gifts which are refused. Then there is a peculiar passage. Naaman knows that when he returns cured, his own king will require him to accompany him to thank the pagan god Rimmon for the cure. Naaman doesn't want to do this, so he asks Elisha's forgiveness in advance for his projected participation in the pagan ritual, and at the same time asks for some earth from the Holy Land to construct an altar to Adonai. Elisha sends him off in peace. It's a rather involved and rich story told in 19 verses. And notice just how many characters are involved.
Not so many. Isn't it just mainly Naaman and Elisha?
But Rick, for the story to play out, in addition to Naaman and Elisha, we need Naaman's wife, the Israelite slave girl, the king of Aram, the king of Israel, Naaman's servants, and Elisha's messenger. Each is intrinsic to the story, and each plays a role in demonstrating the power of God.
Okay, so Naaman becomes a believer, and it's interesting that Elisha helps him even though he's an enemy. But there are lots of stories in the Tanakh about Gentiles becoming believers. How about Yitro or Balaam?
True, but there's a particularly ambiguous passage in verse 8 when Elisha tells the king to send Naaman to him. Rick, would you mind chanting the second part of the verse after the Anachtah, please?
Yavona Elai v'yeda ki yesh navi beYisrael.
Which is translated as, let him come to me, and he will learn that there is a prophet in Israel. Almost everyone thinks that Elisha means that once he cures Naaman, Naaman will become convinced of the power of God. But I think that's a misreading of the phrase.
How so?
First of all, as we know from the rest of the story, Naaman is indeed convinced of the power of God. But Elisha said he will learn that there is a prophet in Israel. And who is the he that Elisha is referring to? I think that it's the king of Israel who needs to learn that Elisha is a true prophet of God. Elisha was a prophet during the reign of at least 4 different kings. The king in our story is never mentioned by name. It's possible that Elisha needed to convince a new king of his power as a prophet. So perhaps this entire story is to convince the king and the leaders of Israel what the common folk already knew.
And by common folk, you mean the Israelite slave girl and Naaman's servants.
Rick, you're catching on. That's why we need all these different characters. The kings represent the political leadership, the servants representing the people, Naaman, the skeptic turned grateful foreigner, and of course, Elisha as the faithful prophet of God, doing his best to convince them all of the power of God. For righteous change to happen, we all have a part to play.
Nice, Josh. How about if I convince you and our viewers of the power of the trope?
Please do, Rick.
So you know by now, my main theory is that the pazers, one of the rarest trope in existence, are on the most important words, or else why would they be there? And we have 3 of them, all in chapter 5, starting in verse 7, on the word Vayehi, and it happened. What happened? What was so important? The king of Israel reads the letter from the king of Aram, and he freaks out. He rips his clothes, he gets angry, he's suspicious, lots of drama there. Then in verse 12, our second pazer again begins the verse on the word halo. And the translation of that word is the questioning phrase, is it not so? At the beginning of the question, kind of like the French n'est-ce pas? But the trope conveys Naaman's astonishment at hearing Elisha's prescription to cure him.
Kind of like, hello, what's going on here?
You got it. He's asking very dismissively, aren't the rivers of my Damascus homeland better than those in Israel? No. And our final pazer is in verse 17 on the tiny word ki, which is usually translated as because. But in this verse, the word ki appears twice. The entire phrase is ki lo ya'aseh od avdecha olav azevach le'elohim acherim ki im ladonai. So here the two keys go together as because and then except. Those two bookends. Naaman is emphasizing that he will never worship pagan gods again, but he will instead be with Adonai. By clearing up his skin disease, Elisha has convinced him of God's power.
Great way to show how pazers can enhance the power of small words.
Thank you. But now I want to turn to a corollary, Larry, of that idea. In our last episode, I talked about my munach-zakef katon theory, but first I have to go back to the beginning of the Haftarah. You did say that there are two miracles in our reading, but you only talked about the second one that starts with chapter 5. The Haftarah opens with the last 3 verses of chapter 4 and a short description of a previous miracle when Elisha feeds a bunch of people with a small amount of bread. Who can't be reminded of the New Testament story of Jesus making enough sandwiches for everyone? Sounds like the Christians borrowed that one from our book. Feeding the masses is a common theme, no?
Well, I don't think it was sandwiches, but yes, many biblical stories are recycled in Christian and Islamic texts.
Like leftovers.
Oh.
Okay, but back to my munach-zakef katon theory. The first one in our Haftarah occurs in chapter 4, verse 43, on the words eten zeh. Notice that it's preceded by yativ on the word ma, grabbing your attention, of course. This is the astonished response of the guy who's supposed to feed 100 hungry men with just 20 loaves of bread. He's saying, ma eten zeh lifnei mea ish. What? I'm supposed to give this to 100 hungry men? Are you kidding me? Are you nuts? How could you even think that?
All that from the tiny word zeh.
Yeah. You know how I like it when the prophets or God uses a little word like zeh to make a point? And there are a few more of those that I think make the point. In chapter 5, verse 3, we have the Israelite slave girl saying, imploring Naaman with Achale Adoni, oh, would that my master come before Elisha. Then in verse 8, like you already discussed, Elisha sends a message to the king, asking for Naaman to be sent to him. The munach-zakef katon there is on Yavona Elai, let him come to me, basically telling the king that this is a matter for the prophet and not the king. And then in verse 18, we've got yet another zeh when Naaman is asking Elisha's forgiveness in advance on la davar hazeh, for this thing. Interestingly, there's a chiasm in this verse. It begins la davar hazeh yislach Adonai le'avdecha, for this thing may Adonai forgive your servant. And the verse ends with yislach Adonai le'avdecha badavar hazeh. May Adonai pardon your servant in this thing.
Sounds like Naaman's got a thing going on.
Yeah. One last note on that penultimate verse. There's a Masoretic note that tells us to ignore the text as written, and it appears on the bottom of the page there, the note. Ignore the text as written, Yislach na. Instead, we're supposed to read it without the na. The na would usually be translated as please. So why did the sages want us to ignore it? Would it make Naaman, the repentant Gentile, look too good by saying please?
Nah.
Very funny. I'm going to chant now. In the Eitz Chaim Chumash, the Haftarah begins on page 672.
But our viewers can follow along on the screen thanks to Norm Gar's lovely text graphics. Rick, let's give our viewers a break. Please chant the entire Haftarah without any breaks. But first, the bracha.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Ve'ishba mi ba'al shalisha vayave le'ish ha'elohim lechem bikurim esrim lechem sorim ve'charmel betziklono vayomer ten la'am V'yochelu Vayomer Meshareto Ma eten ze Lifnei mea ish Vayomer ten la'am V'yochelu Kicho amar Adonai Achol v'hoter Vayiten lifnehem Vayochlu vayotiru Kidvar Adonai V'Naaman Sar Tzva Melech Aram Haya ish Gadol lifnei Adonav Unesu fanim kivo Natan Adonai tshua la'aram V'ha'ish haya gibor chayil metzora Va'aram yatzu gedudim Vayishbu Me'eretz Yisrael Na'ara Ktana Vatehi Lifnei Eshet Naaman Vatomer El Gibirtach Achale Adoni Lifnei Hanavi Asher B'Shomron Az Ye'esof Oto Mitzarato Vayavo Vayagid Ladonav Lemor Kazot V'chazot Dibra Hana'ara Asher Me'eretz Yisrael Vayomer Melech Aram Lech bo Ve'eshlecha sefer el melech Yisrael Vayelech Vayikach biyado Eser kikrei chesef Ve'sheshet alafim zahav Ve'eser chalifot begadim Vayaveh hasefer el melech Yisrael lemor ve'ata kevo hasefer hazeh elecha hine shalachti elecha et Naaman avdi va'asavto mitzarato. Vayihi kikro Melech Yisrael et hasefer vayikra begadav vayomer ha'elohim ani lehamit ul hachayot ki ze sholeach elai le'esof ish mitzarato ki achduna uru ki mitanehu li vayehi ki shmoa Elisha ish Elohim ki kara melech Yisrael et begadav vayishlach El hamelech lemor lama karata begadecha yavona elai veyeda ki yesh navi beYisrael vayavo Naaman besusav uvrichbo vayamod petach habayit leElisha vayishlach elav Elisha malach lemor haloch verachatzta sheva peamim bayarden v'yashov besarecha lecha utahar vayiktsof Naaman vayelach vayomer hine amarti elai yetze yatso ve'amad ve'kara v'shem Adonai Elohav ve'henif yado el hamakom ve'asaf hamtzorah Halo tov amana ufarpar naharot damesek mikol meme Yisrael halo erchatz bahem v'taharti vayifen vayelech bechema Vayikshu avadav, vayidabru elav, vayomru, avi, davar gadol, hanavi, diber elecha, halo ta'aseh, ve'af, ki amar elecha, rechatz utahar. Vayered, vayidbol bayarden, sheva peamim, kidvar ish Elohim, vayashov besaro, ki besar, na'ar katon, vayithar, vayashov el ish Elohim, Hu v'chol machanehu, vayavo, vayamod lefanav, vayomer, hinena yadati, ki ein Elohim b'chol haaretz, ki im b'Yisrael, ve'ata, kach navracha, me'et avdecha vayomer chai Adonai asher amadti lefanav im ekach vayivtzar bo lakachat vayima'en vayomer Naaman valo Yutana le'avdecha masat semed pradim adama ki lo ya'aseh od avdecha olav vazevach le'elohim acherim ki im ladonai ladavar hazeh yislach Adonai le'avdecha bevo Adoni vet rimon lishtachavot shama vehu nish'an al yadi vishtachaveti bet rimon vishtachavayati bet rimon yislach Adonai le'avdecha badavar hazeh vayomer lo lech leshalom vayelech meito kivrat aretz.
Rick, that was great. I really love those narrative haftarot. And this one had some wonderful trope.
I agree. Thanks to Norm Gar for all the beautiful graphics, music, text, and editing. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below, somewhere below. And if you like our video podcast, please forward the link to your friends and family.
Since you did the asking this week, maybe we'll get more fan mail.
Yeah.
We'll be back real soon with 2 separate episodes for Kedoshim. Why 2? Well, you'll just have to come back and find out. In the meantime, we wish you all a happy Yom HaAtzmaut next week and Shabbat Shalom.
And Chag Sameach.